Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can use Flask logic, object-oriented programming and AJAX to create a fully functioning CRUD system that will handle user input for students and their grades and save it to a local file. Okay, so I have a folder opened in my Visual Studio Code and also in my terminal. First thing we're going to do is create a virtual environment just to install our dependencies. So we'll say python 3-m env and then we'll call it myenv. And once that's done, we're just going to activate it. So source myenv bin activate. And now we can actually start installing Flask. So we'll say pip3 install Flask. And then whilst that's happening, we'll come back over to here. We'll create an app.py and this will just hold all of our Flask logic. We'll also create a models.py and this is going to hold all the logic for handling the grades, so that will be all of our object-oriented programming, whereas the app will be our routes. And then we are also going to create a templates folder, which will just have our index.html. And then here we'll just create a HTML5 boilerplate. We'll say student grades. And then in here we are actually going to link to a couple of things. So we'll create a link to Tailwind. So this will be HTTPS and then a CDN of JS deliver, npm, and then Tailwind CSS 2.2.19, and then we want the minified version. We're also going to grab jQuery whilst we're here. So script source. And we'll say googleapis.com/ajax/libs jQuery, and then we'll go for 3.5.1 and we'll get the minified version. And then we'll also link to our static folder. So if we come back to here, create a static, and we'll say script.js, and then in here we're just going to, underneath jQuery, so that we can actually use jQuery inside of our scripts, we will say url4, and then we'll say static, so it's looking for the static folder. We'll say file name, and this will just be script.js. Okay. So to make sure that everything's working, if we come onto our body, we'll say it's got a class of bggray100 and then padding of 1.5 rems. And then we'll say heading 1 of hello world. And we'll also console log hello. We'll put this all inside of a document ready. And then inside of these brackets, we'll pass in a function and put this inside of the document ready. So that way, once all of this is loaded in, including our scripts, we will then run this. So now if we come back to our app.py, we just need to install Flask and actually create a route so that we can just make sure that everything is working correctly. So we'll say from Flask, import Flask. We'll do render template as well, so we can render the index.html, and request and JSONify. And we'll say app is equal to Flask. And then we'll say app.root / so the base root. We will just create an index function, and this will just return render template of index.html. So when it makes this request, it's just going to return this, and it's going to render this. So if we come over to our terminal, make sure that everything is installed correctly, you don't have any issues. So now if we say python 3 app.py, we should have a development server running. Don't know why that's not worked. Yeah. So then at the bottom, we need to have if underscore underscore name is equal to main. We'll say app.run, passing debug equal to true. And now we have a development server running. So if we take this link and then head over to Chrome, we have hello world. There is no padding included. Right, so the issue is there, HTTP. So if we change this back to HTTPS and then refresh, we actually have Tailwind installed correctly. So now if we come back over to here, we're going to actually start with our models because we need a way to track the grades that have been inputted, as well as having classes to actually represent each grade and student. So we'll start by importing JSON, which is a Python package, and we'll also import OS so we can actually work with our operating system. We'll say class student, and we'll create an initialization method that will take in the self parameter. It will take a student ID, and it will also take a name and a grade. So this is going to be run every time we create a new student. So we'll say self.studentID is equal to student ID, self.name is equal to name, and self.grade is equal to grade. And now so the majority of classes that you work with, you will have a toString, and that will basically create a human readable string representation of the object that you've just created. In Python, you often do __ REPR, but what we're going to do is create a dictionary version so that we can actually pass it back as JSON. So we'll say def to dict, and then pass in the self parameter, and we're just going to return a dictionary, which will be student ID, and that will be self.student ID, and then we'll say name, self.name, and then grade, self.grade. So that is the student sorted. We now need to actually have a way to track all of the grades that have been added. So we'll say class grade tracker, and this also is going to need a initialization method, because when we first create the grade tracker, we need to create a file, and we also need to create a list of students that will, when it's first created, be empty. So what we're going to do is first make a file name variable, and this is going to be created on the initialization, so it's just going to be called students.json. And then in here we're going to say self.filename is equal to filename, and then self.students is equal to self.load students, and this is going to be a function that we will create in a second. So when it's first initialized, we are going to call one of its own functions and set that equal to the students variable, or the students attribute. So we'll now create the load students method, and this needs to take in self as a parameter. And then inside of this function, we're just going to say if os.path.exists, and then self.filename. So if there is already a file called that, then we're not going to carry on. So we'll say with open self.filename, and we're going to open it as R so that we can read it. And then we're going to use an alias of F, so we can just say students_data is equal to json.load, and then pass in the file. and we're going to return a dictionary comprehension of the student ID. So we'll say return string, and then we'll say S, and then inside of brackets, so we're going to actually get the student ID key, and then we'll say student, and then we'll use keyword args and pass in S, and then so for S in students underscore data. So this is just going to return a string from each piece of data that's in the students, and we're going to pass in the student through this student. And then if it doesn't exist, we're just going to return an empty dictionary, and this will basically just create the file. So the next thing that we're going to do is have a way to save the student. So def save underscore students. I'm going to pass in the self parameter again. I'm going to say with open self.file name, and then as write. So we can actually write to the file. And then here we'll say json.dump. And then we're going to use a list comprehension again, and we'll say s.toDict. So this is the dictionary method that we created up here. For s in self.students.values. And then we're going to pass in the file as the second parameter so that we can dump this list comprehension into this file. So now we need an add student, and this will actually just handle adding a student to the file. So we'll get the data for each student, and then we'll call this function and pass in the data to that function. So def add student, we'll say self.students, and then we're going to use indexing. We'll say student.student ID, because obviously we're going to be working with these keys here being strings, so we need to make sure that they are strings when we actually use dictionary retrievals, so that it actually matches what's here, because one as a number is different to one as a string. And then we'll just say that that is equal to the student, and we'll say self.save underscore students. So next we need to update the grade. So we'll say def update grade, take in the self, the student ID, and then the new grade. And then here we're just going to say if string of student ID in self.students, and we're going to say self.students, and then we're going to retrieve that specific student by their ID, and we'll say .grade, and then we'll set that equal to the new grade. And because this is going to be a dictionary, we can actually use .grade to access these variables. And we'll say self.save students, just so that it's updated the file. And then we'll say def delete student, take in self and a student ID. And then we're going to say if string of student ID, so the same as what we did above, in self.students. So this just makes sure that there is a student actually there. And we're going to use the del keyword, and we'll say self.students and retrieve the student from that student ID. And then because it's going to be deleted, we need to then save the file again. And then finally, we're just going to create one more function that will just get all of the student data by a specific student. So we'll say def get student, self, and then student ID. And here we're just going to return self.students.get with a string of the student ID. And that is our models created. So if we come back over to our app.py, now we need to create the logic for these. So just to make sure that we can actually use them, we're going to say from models import student and grade tracker. Then underneath the app, we'll say grade tracker is equal to grade tracker. And then we already have our index root, which is fine. So now if we create a new root for add, and we say the methods are post methods, so this will only happen on a post method. We'll say def add student, and obviously because we're going to be adding data, it needs to be a post method. So we'll say data is equal to the request.json, and then we'll say student is equal to, and we're going to make we're going to instantiate the student that we've just created. So we're going to use these methods. So we need to make sure we've got a student ID, a name, and a grade. And here we're going to say data. So we're going to be getting the data from the input fields from a form. So student ID, data name, and then data grade. And then we'll say grade underscore tracker dot add student, and we're just going to pass in the student variable that we've just created there. And we're going to return JSONify, and then inside of this variable we'll say status student added, and this is obviously only going to return a status of student added if it's happened. I mean, even if it's failed on this line for some reason, which it shouldn't, then it will still get student added. So one thing that you can do is use a try catch, and you can say try this, and then if it's worked, then you can output that. Otherwise, you can output return JSONify status student not added. So next we're just going to create an app.root, and we'll say /update. So this is to update the grade. Obviously, because it's updating, it needs to be a post method again. So we'll say def update grade. Data is equal to request.json because we were going to be retrieving it from a form again. And then we'll say grade tracker dot update grade. Data student ID because we obviously need the student ID to update. And then data grade. And then here we're going to say return JSONify status grade updated. So again, if you wanted to try and add in some different handling for things failing, then that would be somewhere that you do it again. And then we'll say app.root /delete. We also need to use a post method again. And we're going to just create a delete student. We'll say data is equal to request.json because we're going to be receiving the student ID that we want to delete. Say grade tracker is equal to, grade tracker dot student dot delete student. And then here it's just going to be data student ID. And then return JSONify status student deleted. And then finally, we're just going to actually just get the data of a specific student. So we'll say app.root /students. And then we're going to say /, and here we're just going to make sure that we're getting an integer back. And we'll say student ID. So here we're going to say def get student, and we're going to pass in the student ID. We're going to say student is equal to grade tracker dot get student, and pass in the student ID again. And then if student will return JSONify student.toDict, and then we'll say else return JSONify error student not found, and then outside of this we'll just return a 404. So that will be our app logic for handling the different routes. So now if we come over to our index.html, we will be adding 3 different forms in so that we can actually make sure that we have a form for specific things. So first we'll say heading 1 with text 3XL, font bold, margin bottom of 6, and then text center. And here we'll just say student grade tracker. And then we'll create a div with a max width of medium. We'll say MX auto, so it will be centralized. BG of white. Padding 6, and then rounded medium and shadow medium. And give it a margin bottom of 6 as well. So here we need to create a form. So we're just going to have a heading 2 that has a text 2XL, font semi-bold, and then margin bottom of 4. And then in here we're going to say add student. And then we'll just create an input type for the student ID, another one for the name, and another one for the grade. So input text, name, student ID. Give it a placeholder of student ID. We can actually we'll need the ID of student ID, and then we'll give it a class of border, P2, width full, and a margin bottom. And then if we just copy this and do it 3 times, change the name and the ID to be name, and then change the name and the ID for this one to be grade. And then we'll change this to be student name, and change this to be student grade. So these will be the placeholders that you'll see on the inputs. And then at the bottom, we're just going to create a button which has an ID of add student and a class of BG blue 500, text white, padding top and bottom, and then left and right. And we'll give it a border radius as well, and we'll just say add student. So now if we come back over to our Chrome and refresh, we have a way to actually add our own student, but this wouldn't actually go anywhere. This is just front end currently because we haven't used JavaScript to hook them up. So now coming back to here, I'm just going to copy and paste these 3 times. So now we have the add student. So then the second one will be update grade. So then we'll change to update student. And because we only need the ID and the new grade, we can remove this input field. And we'll change this name to be update student ID. We'll keep the placeholder to be student ID, and then we'll change this to be new grade. And we'll change this to be new grade. And then inside of this one, we'll change to delete student. We only need the student ID for this. So the input will be text student ID, but we'll change this to say delete student ID, and then delete student ID. And then to just finish off the last one, we will make this view student. And then we will remove the name and the grade because we just need the student ID, and we'll say view student ID. And if we just change these, so we have indigo, we'll change this one to red, and then this one to green. Now if we come back over here and refresh, we have 4 different blocks. So now we have an actual way to be able to add new students. But to change this layout slightly, I might put them all inside of a div, which is grid cols 2, and then we'll put col span on all of them. So col span 1, we'll remove these. We'll remove the widths because it will actually make it a lot easier. And if we put it into 4, then we can see how tight they might be when you first come back. Okay, so then if I give it a gap of 3 rem, we actually have 3 stacked to the side. Okay, so we have the front end sorted, but we just need a way to actually make the front end and the back end talk to each other. So if we come back over to here and then we go to our scripts, just to make sure that our script is actually hooked up, if we inspect the page and then console, we have hello. Okay, so now here, if we come and we remove this, we need to set some event listeners for the buttons that have been clicked. And obviously there's going to be 4 buttons. So we'll start by saying add student dot on click, and we'll create a function. And here we're going to say var student ID is equal to, we're going to get the student ID, which is the ID of this. So student ID, the input field, and we're just going to get the value. Say var name is equal to I think it was actually just name. Yeah. So the ID of name, and we're going to get the val, and then var grade, and this is going to be the same dot val. And then we're going to use an AJAX request. So we'll say $.ajax and we'll pass in a JSON variable. So we'll say URL will be add, type will be post. We'll say content type will be application/JSON. Just so that we know that we are going to be using JSON for it. And then we'll say data JSON.stringify. And then in here we'll say student underscore ID. And then we'll pass in the variable from above. And then we'll say inside of a string, name will be set to the name. And then we'll say grade will be set to grade. And then if it's worked correctly, we're just going to create a success function which has the response, and in here we'll just alert response.status. And then if we come back over to Chrome and we refresh, say student1 name Chris, student grade A, and then if we add the student, we should have got an alert. Internal server error. Okay, so the preview says that add student takes 1 positional argument, but 2 are given. So what it's actually saying is we are missing some parameters here. So we need to have the self parameter, obviously. And we also need to make sure that we can pass in the student. So if we come back to Chrome and we refresh, and then I try this again, we now get our alert, which is set in the scripts. So if I press OK and then come back over to here, we now have a students.json file. If I open this, we have student ID 1, name Chris, grade A. Okay, so let's try and update Chris's grade. So if we come back over to our scripts and we create a new event listener, we'll say update grade, and this is just going to be on click, and then we'll create a function, and inside of here we're just going to get the new grade and the student ID. So we'll say var student ID, and then because we created a new ID for it, it will be update student ID. We're just going to get the value of the input field. We'll say var grade, and then this is going to be new underscore grade and the value. And then we'll create a new AJAX request. And then inside of this, we'll say URL for update. We'll say type, post. Content type will be application JSON again. And then the data, we are just going to use JSON.stringify. And then we'll say student underscore ID, set to student ID, and then grade is set to the grade. And then after this, we're just going to do the same. So we'll create a success function that passes back the response. I'm just going to alert the response.status. So now coming back over to here, if we refresh, we don't need to add a new student because we already have one in our students.json. So if we pass in grade 1 or student 1, we'll change the grade to be AB, and if we update, we still have an issue. Is this because we copied and pasted and didn't change? Yeah, so that's add student. So now if we come back over to here, we change this from add student to be update student. We'll just make sure, so update grade. So the ID of this button needs to match the ID that we are passing to the event listener. So then if we change this to delete student and then use student, and if I try this again, we now have our grade updated. So if I come back over to students.json, you'll see that the grade has actually changed. Okay, so now we need to handle the deleting of the student. So if we come back over to our scripts, and then in here we're just going to say delete student, on click, create a function, and we're just going to get the student ID, and this is going to be this, so the ID of the input field. And then we'll get the value from it. And that's all we actually need for the deletion. So we can pass all of this into the AJAX request already. And we'll just say URL. If I actually take those, change this to delete, keep the application JSON, keep it a post request, and then inside of this, all we need is the student ID, so we can remove the grade. And then we'll just create a success, and we'll say function response, and we'll just alert the response.status. So now if I come back over to here and refresh, student 1, if I delete this, student deleted, come over to here and we'll check students.json, and there is now no student created. So now if I create a new one and add the student, we can now start looking at viewing the student. So now coming back here, that student has been created, and now I'm just going to copy this and then paste it below, and we'll say view student. This will need to change to the name of the input field in this section, so view student ID. And then because it's essentially the same thing, everything else can stay the same apart from this URL, which we need to add the student ID to. So we are just going to concatenate to the end of that the student ID that we have retrieved there. And we can actually remove those because we're not going to be passing anything to it because it's a GET request. And then inside of this success, we'll say if response.error. Then we are going to say student_info .text and then response.error. And then we'll say else student_info .text, we'll say ID, and then we'll say response.student_ID. I'm just going to concatenate some new bits to it, and we'll say name, response.name, and then concatenate the grade, so response.grade. We can remove this alert. And now inside of this view student section, if we just create a p tag with the student info, so right at the very bottom, or a div maybe, just so that it gets outputted correctly, we'll say class of mt4 just to give it a little bit more space, and then this will just have the ID of student info. So now if I come back over to here and I completely refresh this, just make sure that we have a student. Now if I get the student1 ID, students is not defined. Okay, so looking at the preview of the actual AJAX request, it says name error, name students is not defined. So I think that in this get students function is because of the comma. So if we replace that for a full stop and then make sure that it's still running, if I come back over to Google Chrome, refresh, student1, we get ID 1, name Chris, grade C. So now if I add a new student, and then change this to 2, we can view that student, get that grade, and then if we update Chris's grade to be an A star as well, and we delete student 2, then if I come back over to here and check, we only have one student called Chris with a grade of A star. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use object-oriented programming and AJAX to save user data from a front end to an external file. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos coming. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.